Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Kruger. He is a research investigator in the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan in the US. He applies evolutionary principles to advance the understanding of a wide range of human psychology and behavior. Much of his work is founded on life history theory, that will be the main focus of our conversation today, which provides a powerful framework for understanding individual variation. He pursues both basic research to advance theory, as well as applied projects that leverage the most powerful theoretical framework in the life sciences to promote human well-being and sustainability. So, Dr. Kruger, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Well, thank you for your interest. I'm hoping that you can broadcast this interview across the world, and other people who are interested will be able to appreciate it as well.
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, so Dr. Kruger, life history theory. I've already had some people on the show with whom I talked about this, but before we start with the specific questions where you apply life history theory to try to better understand certain aspects of our human psychology, would you like to tell us a little bit about what life history theory is about, where it comes from, and basically give us a brief overview of what it is about?
Sure. Life history theory is really a central part of modern evolutionary biology, and it's been gradually built up in the past century. It's started its origins in questions of why species differ in terms of their life trajectories, in terms of how fast they develop. And the idea is that we have phenotypic flexibility that's based on the environmental conditions that we develop in. And we have limited resources in life, limited time, limited energy, limited effort. So we can't do everything all at once. We can't maximize all the different possible goals that we would like. So we have to make trade-offs in how we invest our energy and effort. And we have a lot of different aspects of life, that we need to invest in, growth, maintenance of the body, fighting off diseases, reproductive effort. So finding partners and then having offspring and investing in those offspring so that they can in turn become successful adults and reproduce themselves. So there's a lot of different aspects of life to invest in, and how do we choose how much to invest in each aspect? That is a question that's shaped by the environmental conditions that we're in. And for many decades, evolutionary biologists have noticed how organisms that develop in less predictable environments, where you have higher extrinsic mortality, for example, deaths that cannot be prevented from how much you invest in it, whether it's from predators or some other source, you can't really control it and you can't predict it. Those organisms that live in less predictable environments have an accelerated life history pattern, accelerated reproduction. So they develop faster and reproduce sooner, and as a consequence have less time and energy and effort, for example, to invest in long-term maintenance of the body and invest in offspring to the extent that other organisms do. So this is a pattern that's seen across species, and it again, this is really central to the understanding of biology for every other species other than human, really. And only in the past few decades have people brought life history theory into human research in trying to better understand how we can explain, variation in our life trajectories and psychological and behavioral aspects that are related to that.
Mhm. You mentioned the fact that the way by which a particular individual develops his life history strategy, that could be a faster paced or a slower paced life history strategy, depends a lot on the environmental conditions he or she is exposed to. But do we know if the life history strategy that a particular individual develops has some genetic basis to it or not?
Well, just about everything that's important in psychology, not only has a genetic basis. I mean, everything that we are is a complex, complex product of the genetic heritage that we have from, many, many, many generations of ancestors, and the selection pressures that they faced, and the environment that we develop in, and also variation in important psychological factors, personality factors. Anytime there's a really good, sort of genetic study that's done on this, they find that, personality, all these things, they're about 50% heritable. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that mean? That means that, there is a genetic, basis to it, and there is some variance that can be explained by our ancestry, but there's also variance that can be explained by our environment. And I like to think of this in terms of reaction norms, meaning that we sort of have this space, based on our heritage, based on our design as a species. We have this range in which we can develop and operate, and depending on the circumstances that we develop in, that more precisely or finely tunes the strategies that we have. So there's going to be an influence, but it's really important for people to understand what it means for something to be genetic, for something to be environmental, because it's not anywhere near as simple as people might think, in the sense that, oh, well, if you have this gene, you're going to do X, genetic determinism. In fact, life history theory is really almost an antidote to deterministic kind of thinking, because it explicitly explains why variation happens in the context of environments, and why strategies may develop a particular way. The theory touches on a lot of different aspects, especially with humans, where we might make value judgments on certain patterns of behavior. But all the different strategies, all the variation in strategies, these are all the strategies that were successful to the environmental challenges that our ancestors faced. So the specific strategy is what would be optimal or just successful given the conditions that someone develops in. So it explains why we have that variation, and also that variation is functional and adaptive in an evolutionary sense. As modern humans, we get a lot more complicated, and we have a lot of different values, and we've changed our environments considerably from those of our ancestors. The human life is very, very different than it was even a couple hundred years ago. So sometimes that gives rise to challenges. This idea of mismatch, which can be general. We have some general properties where, for example, people are living in these urban environments with massive numbers of people, and it can be very anonymous, and that could be very different from the idea of classically evolving in a group of people that many people were related, extended kin, maybe about 150 people on average. So there's some aspects that are sort of universal mismatches, but there could also be mismatches that vary based on differences in ancestral ecologies. And the greater the degree of mismatch between the ancestral and current environments, that could lead to discrepancies and behavioral patterns that people might consider optimal for certain environments. But we all we had to be really careful about this because we do have, sort of different levels of thinking about this, and we had to really understand the patterns and why they are. And if we do have goals in terms of shaping behavior, in terms of getting people to live the longest, healthiest lifestyles possible, we have to understand really, what is going to work and what's not going to work in terms of fostering and encouraging behaviors. So, we talked about this notion of, faster and slower life history, which we can talk about more because I think it's a little more elaborate than just one unified continuum.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of aspects of slower life history in humans that are valued by many modern societies. So long-term future orientation, high investment in offspring, stable families, a lot of things that are highly valued. And if we want to promote that and we want to encourage that, the best thing to do is really to have a stable infrastructure where the important resources for life, food, shelter, safety, etc., are predictable, reliable, and stable for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So, for people who would like to, shift life history, and that might be a value that, that many people hold and policymakers might have, the kind of interventions that would be necessary to do that would be very substantial. And the cost of that may be high, but the overall long-term benefit may also be high as well. So in a sense, it's at a society level, one of these challenges in time orientation of, are we willing to make this kind of investment, this potentially massive investment for a very, very long-term and population-wide benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we will go back to, or we'll come back to questions related to wealth later on in the interview. But let me just pick up on one aspect that you mentioned there, that it's not correct or really correct for us to look at life history strategies as if they were in a continuum from slower pace to faster paced life history strategies. And maybe when I posed my last question or my previous question, I even sort of created a dichotomy there, like if there were only a fast-paced and slower-paced life history strategy and nothing in between or any other aspects related to them. So could you explain what are the different life history strategies that we have and what are the aspects that we consider in each of them, let's say?
Sure. So life history theory has matured, over the years in terms of its understanding. Originally, people were studying other species and were understanding, why some species developed, faster than others, and introduce these terms R selection and K selection.
Mm-hmm.
R based on the rate of reproduction, and K based on the the population carrying capacity, right? So the idea was that if you had a new island, say there's a new set of islands that were created by underwater volcanic activity, and then species came and then colonized those islands, then they would only be limited by the rate at which they can reproduce. So they're R selected, meaning that they should reproduce and take over this island as fast as possible before anybody else gets there, right? But then when the island is saturated, when you have many individuals competing with each other for limited resources, then it's going to be limited by the carrying capacity of the of that environment. So K selected, and this was a notion that made its way into early formulations of life history in psychology in terms of putting humans on this continuum. one of the challenges is that all humans are strongly case-selected. So if you look at human life history patterns and compare those across species, we do have variation, but it really is at what would be called the slow end of the continuum. So all humans are strongly case-selected. All humans have slow life history strategies compared to other organisms. And now the terms R selection and K selection, they've sort of fallen out of favor, and people have shifted to using the terms faster and slower life history. And again, those are relative, because it's faster compared to who. We're certainly not fast if you compare us even within mammals to rabbits or mice or some other species that might reproduce several times a year with large litters, right? But what I like to think of life history in a framework of trade-offs between all the different aspects of life. And I think of this as sort of like a mobile that hangs from the ceiling, one of these, sort of like an art piece that has, split, and then there's things that hang off the sides, and then that splits again, and then there's things that hang off there. And it's a set of nested trade-offs. And when you invest more in one particular area, that's going to, you're basically like pulling on one of those little parts, the mobile. So that's going to shift what's happening both nearby. But if you'll notice, the entire system also shifts. Sometimes, more so in the areas that's close to where you're making this change, but the whole system shifts. So it's all related. And there's different aspects of life history where, because we have trade-offs, we have inverse relationships between how much can be invested in each. So in humans, I think mating effort and parenting effort is part of the critical critical pieces here, where the more individuals invest in mating effort, trying to get new partners, trying to get new reproductive opportunities, the less they're going to be able to invest in parenting, in the long-term resource investment and caretaking of offspring. And it looks like these are inversely related dimensions, but they do have some separation. So it's not just one thing where, you just have one continuum from mating on one side and parenting on the other. There's certainly some complexity there. For example, you could have some people, who have a lot of resources. So for example, a man who's very high social status, they might be able to invest highly on their offspring, in their legitimate offspring, and do things to ensure that those offspring will become, the ruling class of the next generation. But at the same time, they may be having affairs on the side and may have, many illegitimate offspring, and that's just in a supposedly monogamous society. So would that man be high in mating? Would it be high in parenting? It's potentially high in both, but that might be an extreme case where, someone has the resources and status to be able to do, both of those things. For most people, there's going to be a trade-off, and the more that's invested in one area, the less that's invested in another. And there's, not just in my own research, but, other research groups are starting to demonstrate that there really seems to be multiple related dimensions of life history, even within humans, and certainly amongst other species. It gets a lot more complicated than just having one unified continuum. But we're sort of in a transitional period now. It's sort of like when a space probe is, when is it leaving the solar system, and then when is it entering interstellar space? So I think that there's still utility in models and measures, where people are measuring, faster or slower life histories and using that to predict things. And I certainly have my own set of measures. I originally, brought life history into psychology sort of on my own, because I wasn't aware of the other literature. This is back, around the year, 2000, 2001. I was working with, Randy Nesse, and he was, giving me these books on the theory of life history that were, very mathematical, very, very much, abstract, theoretical, mathematical, and talking across species. So there really wasn't much connection with the life history research that was going on with humans at the time. So what I did was, I thought, well, okay, so this is all very interesting, but how do we integrate this with psychology? What do psychologists do? Well, we give people surveys and we have them answer survey questions, and maybe we're able to track their behavior sometimes too. So my idea was, well, how do we integrate life history theory into evolutionary psychology? Well, we develop scales. We develop constructs for mating effort, for parenting effort, and for time orientation or time perspective. And fortunately, there had been already considerable research on time orientation and time perspective. Phil Zimbardo is a famous social psychologist who was interested in it and developed a scale. There's other people like Walter Mischel, who has the famous so-called marshmallow test, where these 4-year-olds will see whether they can wait a few minutes to get 2 Oreo cookies rather than 1, and those who can wait, that predicts life outcomes 30 years down the road, which is really fascinating. And what's even more fascinating to me is that recently other researchers have finessed this in terms of changing the environment that these children are in. And if they have a study situation where the researcher is unreliable, meaning that these children, they don't really know whether or not they're really going to get that second cookie. They don't have that complete trust in them. They're more likely to just go for 1 cookie, rather than wait for 2. So that really fits in really well, with life history theory of like, here's a very, very immediate and environmental condition that's shaping whether or not they're going to delay their gratification. If they don't think they can really get that future reward, take what you can now, because this might be your only opportunity. So that is a really nice elaboration of Michel's classic experiment that I think fits in really well for life history. So there already were people in psychology, also in economics, talking about time horizons and such. So there already were quite a few measures of time perspective and time horizons, and that's something that we can try to sort through and now see what's the best way to assess this and integrate it into theory. Also, I developed scales of mating effort and parenting effort, and I found them quite useful. But the challenge was that I was coming from a different direction, and I wasn't aware that there were other people working on these same issues, and there were already established measures. So people weren't interested in my measures, unfortunately, at the time. But I think the time is right now. I think enough people, are coming to the realization that, things may be, more complicated. I think there's other people who are trying to sort of push the boundaries of theory now. And I think there's a lot more interest, in measurement and sort of picking these measures apart and seeing, what do they actually measure? What do they actually predict? How can we really enhance life history measurement? So if anyone's interested in exploring this, and especially if they're interested in picking apart my measures and using them in their own studies, or even critiquing them and trying to enhance and improve them, I'll be really, really grateful for that.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about that psychology of time perspective, because later on, when we talk about adolescent or certain aspects of adolescent behavior, maybe that will be relevant. So, what is this evolved psychology of time perspective about, and what are the factors behind it?
Right. So it's a big challenge in terms of uh, trying to understand your environment and just how predictable events in your environment are going to be. And when you can't really predict important, important life events, if you can't predict mortality, if you can't predict whether access to resources is going to be stable, you may develop a more opportunistic time perspective to take advantage of what's available now, the resources that are available now, the opportunities you have now, because you don't really know what's going to happen down the road. In fact, it might not be possible to take advantage of these same resources in the future, and you may not be able to predict whether or not conditions are going to improve. So we see a lot more opportunistic behavior. So in the parlance of some of these psychological models, the desires for immediate gratification rather than delayed gratification. Basically, people taking advantage of the opportunities that present themselves and investing less in ways that may not pay off in the immediate future, but is more like a stable bank account where, if you invest now, it's going to gain interest and you're going to have greater rewards in the future based on what you invest now. And that really is a fundamental trade-off that I think relates to a lot of important, life domains. Even thinking of this bank account example, I think there's a lot of financial implications that aren't fully realized in this. One things that I've been pushing with life history theory is to move beyond the sexy topics that evolutionary psychology is sometimes accused of focusing on. Everyone knows that sex sells, and mating effort and studies about mating are sexy. So there's been a lot of focus on that, but I think that life history theory is applicable to many more important domains of life than just sex and reproduction and mating related behavior. So I think that this is something that we'll see as research matures and more research is done. We will see how developmental environments and the stability of those developmental environments, and the stability of family and the stability of resources, the stability of safety, how these can really shape people's behavioral trajectories and important life domains, and the extent to which they are opportunistic and taking advantage of immediate conditions and immediate opportunities, and the extent to which they are going to be acting in very, very long-term long-term frameworks. And it's challenging, and this is not going to be easy, because I don't think we really evolved in environments that existed on 10, 20, 30-year time scales. I think that there are probably a lot of human experience has been in ecologies that are seasonal. So over the course of the year, we know, if you're an agricultural society, when you have to, get the land ready for planting, and when you need to plant, and when you need to harvest, and when you need to store your grain and such. So there's a cyclical, seasonal aspect to this that I think that might encourage, longer time horizons, because you have to plan for the future, right? But I think that the kind of time horizons that we have in our modern technologically advanced societies are probably far longer than than those that our ancestors faced, and this can be a real challenge for us.
Mhm. And that relates to one of the concepts that you were talking about a couple of minutes ago, that was evolutionary mismatch, right? That probably our minds evolved in an ecological context that where we really didn't have to think about or planning things for the next, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years, because basically we got something. For example, if men went out to hunt, they hunted the animal, and since they didn't have any preservation methods, they would eat it right away as soon as they got back to the group or the tribe or the clan or whatever. And the same with the food that women gathered and things like that, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are on shorter time scales, there are certainly patterns. So there are patterns of seasonality when, certain edible plants are ready to be harvested, when berries mature, etc. And in hunting, there might be small game that are available, throughout the year, but large game migrate, so there might be migrational patterns that people need to pay attention to. But again, that's cyclical over the course of a year, right?
yeah.
So you can feel the days getting colder, the sunlight getting shorter, and you can know, okay, well, it's going to be migration season. But that's on a year-to-year basis. It's not what are what are we going to do now so that 10 or 15 years from now we can take the most advantage of these animal migration routes. I don't think that, I don't think it was possible to predict. I don't think that's one of the challenges that we face. There's a lot of, there's a lot of aspects of our psychology where it's like, oh, geez, if we could only do this, well, why don't we think this way? Our ancestors wouldn't have benefited from understanding nuclear physics, or some other aspects that are so puzzling to a lot of people. We don't understand things at micro levels of scale. Our understandings seem to be best when they're most closely related to the challenges that our ancestors faced in terms of the things we could do and we could act upon. And I think you see that a lot in the way that people take all sorts of different issues and they see it in the social framework, the framework of social interaction. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but I think that's probably another full topic.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's for sure. So let me just ask you one question about life history strategies that we haven't addressed yet. So are there any relevant or important sex differences in terms of the life history strategies that individuals tend to develop? I mean, is it that there are important differences between men and women in terms of the kinds of life history strategies that they develop in their lifetimes, or not?
yes. Men and women are from the same species, so we do have a lot of commonality, but at the same time, there are huge differences in the levels of necessary parental investment in reproduction. So if you go back to your basic biology, the definition of sex is not based on chromosomes or even hormones. It's based on how much is physiologically invested in the gametes, right, in the sperm and the egg. And when you have two gametes, you have this pattern where the more you invest in the gamete, the more viable it is, the more likely it is to successfully, survive and lead to offspring. But the fewer gametes you can make. So we tend to have sexes, when you have sexual reproduction, when you have gametes, sex cells, from different individuals that come together to make a new organism, you have individuals that specialize in this physiological investment and investing more in the soma, investing more physiologically in these gametes, and we call those, the eggs, or the sex cells that females, create. And then when you have that sufficient investment, the other strategy is to create many, many more gametes, because those are going to be much more successful if the somatic investment is already there. Basically make as many as possible. So those are the sperm or the sex cells that males produce. So that's the basic biological definition of sex. Goes all the way back to the gametes they reproduce, and you can see differences in other species based on that. But in humans, I mean, we're mammals, so in mammals, females breastfeed offspring and have a much longer period of care and nurturing than in most non-mammalian species. And then in humans, out of mammals, we have incredible amounts of parental investment because our offspring are relatively immature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because of the whole constraints and trade-offs between our large brain size and the width of the pelvis that we have for bipedal locomotion. Basically, human infants are born premature. Mm-hmm. All human infants are born premature compared to how they would be in other mammalian species. And that just increases the period of dependency, and that increases the requirements of investment. And there is high levels of paternal investment, so father's investment in offspring on average, but it's not guaranteed. And you usually see a considerable difference between women's and men's parental investment, and that really shapes a lot of these sex differences we see. And on the other side, women are much more limited in terms of their reproductive capacity, how many offspring you can successfully have. I don't know if you've heard about this television show about the Kruger family in the United States. I think they had at least 21 children, something like this, and this made them famous. They got a television show because that's just an incredible amount of children for one woman to have. But if you put this family on the continuum of male reproductive success, you could see that there are men who have many, many more offspring than that. And then, genetic studies now are showing how, historical figures, like Genghis Khan and other, other considerable historical figures and leaders have contributed disproportionately to the human gene pool. So basically, mm-hmm. male reproductive success is going to be much more variable and skewed than female reproductive success. So some men may not reproduce at all, whereas others are going to have many more offspring than other men. And this is going to increase the intensity of male mating competition. So because of this, men are going to invest a lot more in mating competition than women. So these two, aligned issues, they sort of, they're working in alignment with each other. They're part of the same overall pattern that, women have much greater obligatory parental investment, necessary parental investment, even before childbirth, and men face much higher mating competition. That, I think, shapes a lot of aspects of life. And honestly, I think it's responsible for a lot of these conflicts that you see, the so-called battle of the sexes, because the interests are different to some extent. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of shared interest in successfully producing offspring, and ideally you'd have both partners investing high degree, but there's differential costs and benefits, for example, even for being monogamous. So I think that those differences in life history contribute to the drama and complexity of human life.
Sure. And I mean, you were talking about male competition, and I guess that in the context of life history theory, there's also another important sex difference that has to do with risky behavior. I mean, males exhibit much more risky behavior than females in our species, and that's because for males it has higher payoffs, right?
Right, and also greater risk if you don't succeed to not reproduce at all. So this is part of part of high mating effort is these patterns of risky and opportunistic behavior. So we do see this this pretty substantial difference in tendencies, and that's not to say that no woman is going to take risks or that all men are high in risk taking, but across different classes of behavior, you can see ways in which men have riskier patterns than women, and you can say, well, what does that mean to be risky? It's when the outcomes are variable and uncertain, and you may succeed, you may not. I mean, that's the inherent sense of risk, but the idea is that because of the skew in male reproductive success, basically that the men at the top reproduced a lot more and contributed a lot more to our gene pool than the ones in the middle, and the ones at the bottom didn't contribute at all. This is selected for these risk-taking tendencies, to try to take advantage of opportunities and do things that enhance, male status and enhance their ability to compete for female partners.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, there are researchers that suggest that probably one of the reasons why modern societies all have legally stated or legally determined monogamy is because that renders them more stable, because otherwise if there's a skewed sex ratio in favor of men and there are many more men than women, for example, then there are many men left without partners, and particularly the younger ones are more prone to violence. Correct.
Right. That's actually related to one of the papers that we have, where greater degrees of polygamy, meaning greater degrees of skew in male reproductive success, when some men are much more successful than others, that's related to greater male mortality. So we see that as a very direct relationship, even when we control for other important factors you usually need to do when you're comparing across populations. But yeah, the enforced monogamy, that's one way of promoting stability, because if people follow the rules, then it limits men to one partner, or at least one partner at a time, so it gives more opportunities for other men. Even systems, for example, in classical Islam, a man could have 4 wives, right? And people who are from monogamous cultures might think, oh well, how could this be? That's very different from what we do. But in a way, that was also a way to limit male competition and male violence, because prior to that, if you didn't have a restriction, then some men could have 30 partners or 50 partners, and thus taking away the partners that other men could have. So even that, the 4-to-1 ratio, that might have been a reduction in variation and skew in male reproductive success compared to what was going on before. So we can see how some of these cultural norms definitely have tried to promote stability across history.
Yeah, and in what ways does life history theory, I mean, you've already alluded to this earlier on in the interview, but in what ways does life history theory connect with certain health issues that we can, that we can develop better strategies to solve if we apply it to them?
Right. Well, this is an exciting area, for me, because again, it's broadening the application of life history theory beyond, the sexy topics of the direct studies on mating and such. So we've already talked about how life history variation relates to time perspectives and time horizons, and also to the riskiness of behavioral strategies. And with our modern health challenges, we've really shifted. So there's been an epidemiological transition from the types of threats that our ancestors faced that caused most mortality. So, infectious diseases, injuries that would lead to death, in the absence of modern medical treatment, pathogens and parasites, and also predation, from other species. So to a large extent, we've controlled these. Now this is a historical example of how we're still susceptible, and we still have to be careful. But if you look at large time scales, the last few hundred years, because of modern public health efforts of sanitation, of providing clean water, and because of advances in medical technology of saving people's lives in danger, to a lesser degree actually than public health efforts, but we've been able to reduce mortality rates, extend the average human lifespan, and provide for healthier conditions overall. But we've also been able to increase our food supply and reduce labor, that's necessary for just the daily activities of life. So we've seen this epidemiological transition from causes of death that were formerly, infectious diseases, like I said, and pathogens, parasites, towards what we call lifestyle diseases, things that are largely a product of our modern consumer environment. So things that are related to, obesity, lack of exercise, improper nutrition. So we have cardiovascular disease now as the number one, source of death. So we shifted in these causes of death, and these so-called lifestyle diseases are greatly influenced by our behaviors. And again, that gets into this the time horizons or time perspective, because the health behaviors that we're performing now sometimes have an impact decades later. So even in terms of tobacco smoking, you can see the strongest relationships in terms of mortality and health outcomes 30 years down the road. The amount of exercise that you have in your 20s and 30s, that's going to impact your health in later decades in life. Say it's never too late to start. Definitely right now, today, everyone could start living a healthier life, than they do right now. But a lot of these behaviors have a long-term health impact. So thus you have this trade-off of how much am I going to invest in terms of my time and effort to do these things that on a daily basis, could even just be taking up my time or making things more complicated, or I'm not getting as many treats as I would like, for a longer term payoff, for better health, over an extended lifetime. And what we're finding is that we can look at these health outcomes, and we can look at these health behaviors, and we can see how they directly relate to life history variation using some of the classic measures, even just the measures that have a unidimensional continuum. Those people who are at the slower end of the scale are more likely to perform those health promoting behaviors, like having regular exercise, eating 5 or more fresh fruits and vegetables a day, and they're less likely to take these risky behaviors. So smoking tobacco, doing other things that are putting your health at risk. So both the health promoting behaviors and the health adverse behaviors, also excessive alcohol consumption, so called binge drinking. But these are things that directly relate to our overall time horizons that are part of our life history variation.
Mhm. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if you want to talk too much about this or not, but since we are mentioning it before we started the interview, in regards to time perspective, as you said, it has some association with certain risky behaviors. Do you want to tell us if time perspective could also explain behaviors associated with the current pandemic with COVID-19 and people being more willing or not to adopt the healthier behaviors?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we may be able to find the relationship. So one of the psychological constructs that is related to time perspectives and time horizons is conscientiousness. Okay, it's one of these personality dimensions that has more to it, than just time horizons and planning. But I think we could look at people's COVID related behaviors, and I think that those would relate to conscientiousness and in general to to life history variation. So that would be a pretty interesting study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let me just ask you about one last topic before we go. I know that you said that perhaps mating is a very sexy topic in evolutionary psychology, and it's interesting to look at topics that are not that sexy. But since you studied this and I haven't talked about it with anyone before on the show, let me ask you about negative postcoital emotions, because I mean you've studied these and there are also postcoital behaviors that vary according to the mating strategy, if it is short term or long term, and there are sex differences there. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is another area where I've sort of tried to push the envelope beyond where most of the current interest or efforts are, understanding that for humans, as we talked about, we have tremendous amounts of parental investment that are necessary for offspring. That means that the importance of sexual behaviors and the dynamics between men and women, that doesn't end with the act of sex, right? Even after the possible fertilization. So there's so much research, not just from the framework of evolutionary psychology, but from psychology in general, on all those things that lead up to sex and even the act of sex itself. But my collaborator Susan Hughes and I were working on this, and we saw there's very little very little on what happens after sex. And we thought that this is going to be really important too, because, as we discussed earlier, men and women have, different levels of costs and benefits for certain reproductive behaviors. And we thought there could be, so this tension, because of this differential costs and benefits, for partners who had advanced to the point of having sex but weren't married. They weren't in a committed relationship yet. So the costs and benefits would be different, because the woman might potentially be pregnant, right? And she would need, it would be really helpful to have that paternal investment for the father. In modern societies, we have other mechanisms, for investment, but studies in foraging populations, the anthropologists study in very, very different populations, children who grow up without a father present are much more likely to die, before they reach maturity. And there's a lot of research, even in modern populations, about the detrimental consequences of father absence or non-residential fathers. So this is something that women might have a greater desire for expressions of commitment and bonding in this time after sex. And I think it might be something we could think about in terms of even the physiological underpinnings, oxytocin and all these other hormones that are raging through the body. This is sort of prime time for these moments of intimacy, for couples to both establish and maintain their relationship in terms of emotional intimacy, right? And at the same time, that men would benefit from paternal investment, from paternal effort. They have greater incentives for having multiple partnerships, right? So they have less of an incentive to commit, to that one relationship than, compared to women. So you're going to see this tension there. And what Susan Hughes and I found was that men and women differ in terms of what predicts their relationship satisfaction in the time that the couple spend together after they have sexual intercourse. So for women, those women who wish that their partners gave them more expressions of bonding and commitment, they wish that their partners were, being more reassuring in terms of the long-term trajectory of the relationship, they were less satisfied. So they're craving greater signals of bonding and commitment. Whereas for men, they were less satisfied the degree to which their sexual partners wanted to talk about relationship issues, more than they did. So for them, they wanted to avoid the topic, and they were less satisfied when when they did. And related to this, we've also done some other studies on a topic that it seems silly, but we think there might actually be some good underlying theory for this, why men are more likely to fall asleep first after sex than women. And we've gathered a lot of data on this, and we find that this pattern seems to hold up, that men in general in these relationships where they haven't established a formal commitment like marriage, but you've reached the point of having sexual intercourse with each other, that the men tend to fall asleep first. And we think that this might be a non-conscious strategy, in the sense that if the men fall asleep, then they can avoid that commitment conversation without being rude. Right? So they have plausible deniability that, oh no, I wasn't, it's not that they don't want to talk about it, or they, get huffy or hostile when the woman brings it up. They just, they just fall asleep. So we think that it's something that, is kind of catchy and might seem a little silly, but I think it really, does provide insight into our psychology and the psychology of sex differences, and making connections to deeper understandings of differences in life history challenges for men and women.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so, Dr. Kruger, let's end the interview here. But just before we go, would you like to mention what would be some of the best places on the internet for people to get in touch with your work?
Yeah, I have a website at the University of Michigan. So you can just search for Daniel Kruger, University of Michigan. You might even be able to put a link in your video. And my email address is there, as well as many of my papers. Some journals don't like it if you post the papers directly online. So if those aren't available, please contact me. But I do have a lot of papers and abstracts up there, from my work.
Great. So I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Kruger, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. And it was a real pleasure to everyone.
For me as well. And best wishes to you.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litska and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klimpy, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Belby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.